Hello and welcome back to another update. It is your host Weeb Union and we're covering the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We have seen since the past update a few Russian armored assaults and some Ukrainian counterattacks. So let's get straight into it here to the west of Avdiivka. We have two advances by the Russians in this section of the front line. The first one is to the north of Pervomaiske and the second one is to the northwest of Tonenke. The Russians have managed to advance in both of these directions due to recent developments in these sections of the front line. In the direction of Pervomaiske, with the recent Russian push through the western parts of the town, they've managed to secure the northern flank, and with that the Russians are going to be developing their offensive operations through the roads and push in the northern direction towards the Ukrainian fortifications in the area. The Russians are here looking to create a buffer zone to the north of Pervomaiske for them to continue pushing in a western direction through Netelove and prevent the Ukrainians from launching a counterattack by creating this gap between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. At the same time, there's been recent Russian advances west of Tonenke, pushing through the fields one by one and have now reached the Ukrainian defensive line to the south of Umanske, west of Tonenke, that is located here to the north of Pervomaiske, and they have managed to gain a foothold within the easternmost one of them. With this, there is going to be a series of offensive operations by the Russians to capture these fortifications and secure the southern parts of Umanske. At the same time, we see that the Russians have pushed to the northwest of Tonenke, where they've managed to reach this western part of the town and have reached the river line here to the north and to the south of Umanske, pushing the Ukrainians across the river line. With this, the Russians are likely to soon gain full control over the southern parts of the river line and either push further towards Umanske and gain a foothold within the southern parts of the village, or push across the river line to attack the Ukrainian fortifications on the high ground. My guess is the former rather than the latter, with the Russians looking to push in a westward direction both towards Umanske and the Ukrainian fortifications east of Yasno-Brodivka, and to push through the Ukrainian fortifications to the north of Pervomaiske, gaining control over the fields here to the west of Tonenke, before pushing down south towards Netelove and north towards Umanske, bypassing the fortifications and cutting off the supply line. If the Russians manage to gain control over Umanske across the river line and the fighting continues and advancements continues in Semenivka, the Russians could gain full control over the supply routes in and out of the fortifications in between these two villages, which would allow the Russians to subsequently cut them off and encircle them, cutting them off from all of their supplies, allowing them to win without fighting them, or force them to withdraw from these fortified positions and back towards the next line of defense that the Ukrainians have available. We see that there is geolocated footage here to the north of Tonenke and in the direction of Semenivka, as Russians have advanced in both of these directions. The sequence of events west of Tonenke is a series of Russian armored assaults where, approximately according to Ukrainian sources, 36 tanks and 12 infantry fighting vehicles launched assaults across these fields, of which the Ukrainians claimed to have destroyed 12 tanks and 8 infantry fighting vehicles during the fighting, in which the Russians managed to capture these 5 fields west of Tonenke. Responding to these armored assaults, the Ukrainians launched massive artillery strikes, ATGM strikes, and FPV strikes on the advancing Russian tanks and armored vehicles. However, from all the video evidence I could have gathered from the strike so far, there's only evidence of 8 vehicles being struck, despite the Ukrainians claiming 20. However, there is likely a gray number, as some footages are not shown, so it could be true, but it could also not be true, as there's no evidence of the 20 that they claim to have struck. But following these offensive operations, the Russians have managed to push through the fields west of Tonenke through to the Ukrainian fortifications north of Pervomaiske and up north as well towards the Ukrainian fortifications east of Umanske. And with this, we see that the Russians have managed to advance significantly. At the same time, there is this geolocated footage confirming a Ukrainian counterattack with their own armored vehicles. This indicates that the number that they're claiming likely also includes from the fighting where the Ukrainians launched this counterattack to try and prevent the Russians from advancing further, With this, we see that there's some positional fighting back and forth, and the Ukrainians are committing their reserves to push back the Russians and to hold their defensive lines, preventing the Russians from actually achieving a breakthrough. In the meantime, Western media use this as an opportunity to claim that the Russians are unable to launch offensive operations. We see this large Russian attack illustrates Russia's weakness, analyst says, where he then goes on to talk about how with the 800,000 shells coming from the Czech Republic, as well as the increased use of FPV drones and the quote-unquote Russia in manpower problems, despite the Western analysts claiming that Russia is mobilizing or recruiting 30,000 soldiers every month, and official Russian sources claiming a number slightly higher than that. There should be no manpower problems for the Russians, but instead for the Ukrainians, where they are failing to do that. But throughout this article, it pretty much talks about how the Russians cannot launch any offensive operations because they are simply too weak, the Ukrainians are too strong. We're not going to see Russian forces encircle Kiev or a collapse of the Ukrainian defensive lines, because if the Ukrainians can defend without shells, they will surely defend with shells. However, his thinking is flawed. The main reason for that is the main way the Ukrainians are currently defending against Russian advances are the use of FPV drones. We have seen a significant increase in the usage of those compared to other weaponry, which are running lower and lower, so to the point where the Ukrainians are struggling to not ration these sorts of weapons like artillery and ATGMs, to the point where Russian advances are usually only stopped by the use of their own armored vehicles counterattacking, as we saw with geolocated footage, and the combined usage of the FPV drones. Now, the main reason that that is important is because the FPV drones need operators who are nearby, within a certain range. I'm not sure exactly what that range is, but it is definitely less than 50 kilometers and more likely somewhere around 20 kilometers. Now, let's take this as an example. Let's say Ukrainians have a lot of drone operators in Sumy. The Russians launch an offensive operation in the direction of Sumy. This offensive operation consists of 2 Russian divisions. These 2 Russian divisions have over 100 tanks, somewhere around 300 to 400 tanks. They also have hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. Now, the Ukrainians have a significant portion of FPV drone operators, let's say 100. That means that every 1 point, 100 drones can fly towards these armored vehicles. Let's say the Ukrainians have a 100% hit rate, but the drones have a 50% disable rate. That means half of them disable the vehicle that they hit and half of they don't. This is very high rates and very much in favor of the Ukrainians. The period of time it takes for these drones to fly towards the front, hit the Russian vehicles, and then switch over to the next one is a long period of time. And eventually the Russians would push through these fortified positions and reach the areas where these drone operators are functioning, which would force the Ukrainian drone operators to withdraw. They could either hit 1 time and then withdraw following that to a next position, after which they'll continue being on the run and trying to hit while on the run, or the Russians will continue pushing and eventually overrun them. Or the Russians would simply advance slowly and securely and keep getting hit. That is exactly what we're seeing at the front line right now. The Russians are very slowly advancing, and this is making it very easy for these drone operators to just stay in one place. While if they were forced to withdraw after every strike due to the Russian advances being too many for them to deal with at once, this makes it very difficult for them to actually function. This is why we're seeing that the weakness of the drone operators is that they need to be close by the front line to function. Otherwise, they will not be able to launch these drones to attack due to the limited range of them. What I'm saying is that theoretically, if the Ukrainians have 1 million drones, as Zelensky wants Ukraine to have at the end of 2024, it won't matter if the drone operators are overrun by a Russian armored offensive that overruns the Ukrainian positions due to the lack of frontline personnel armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, artillery shells, etc. that can launch attacks in large volumes over a prolonged period of time, unlike drones. Finally, we take a look to the west of Bakhmut, where the Russians have managed to capture the final parts of the first defensive line in direction of Jazov Yar, leaving the final defensive line here by the canal and eastern parts of Jazov Yar left. This is the final defensive line because there's only one line between Russia and the canal, and that is the forest area here that is part of the first line, and then there are the fortifications by the first line here, after which there is the fortifications in Jazov Yar itself. Therefore, there's one line of fortifications between Russia and Jazov Yar, and this means that the Battle of Jazov Yar is on the verge of starting. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content.